Thanks for buying the tickets. Oh, buddy.
All right. Well, thank everybody for coming tonight. For those who don't know, this is Danny Glover. And I'm Armond White. I guess we're all here for one or two reasons. That's either because we like the films that are part of the schedule, or we like the character that comes through in Danny Glover's acting, which means in a sense that we like the person who does that acting. As a film critic, and simply as a moviegoer, I'm the kind of person who sort of would like to lay waste to the fallacy that actors disappear inside the roles they play. I like to think, and I don't know if Danny agrees with this, but I like to think that every actor, like every artist, has a personality, and that personality comes through in their work, even when they do different things. And I think there's something about Danny Glover's character that comes through that makes us respond to him, that makes us want to see him again. So tonight we're going to put Danny on the spot and talk a bit about his persona and about how that persona got put before the public in film and on stage and on screen. But first, before we do that, I want to share a theory of mine with you and with the audience. And this theory is that in 1992, we're into the 8th year of what I think of as the ethnic expansion of American pop culture, particularly the movies, and especially pop culture is affected by the impact of black artists. I date this from 1984, with the growing influence of hip-hop music at that time, and with 3 specific movies that opened in 1984. A Soldier's Story, Prince's Purple Rain, and Places in the Heart, the Robert Benton film that was essentially a Hollywood allegory for race and political consciousness that is looking back to the Great Depression. That's the first film in which I noticed Danny Glover, the first film in which he was given the opportunity to make an impact and also to make meaning. And since Places, Danny's ascending film career has brought forth a consistent black presence in film. He's come to represent, I think, or at least for me, the consistent presence of black actors such as Eddie Murphy and Whoopi Goldberg and Denzel Washington and many others. This all seems to have happened after '84. And the movies, I think, have been improving ever since because of that. I wrote an article after The Color Purple came out in which I sort of brashly called Danny Glover the key African-American film actor, the most important black actor since Sidney Poitier. I meant it then, but I never guessed how true that statement would prove to be, and I think the Walker series proves that out. In movies like Places in the Heart, The Color Purple, Lethal Weapon, A Rage in Harlem, A Raisin in the Sun, To Sleep with Anger, and Mandela, I think all those movies confirm that he is an important actor in this period. That's quite a list. In fact, in the past 5 years, I don't think there's been only 3 other important American films about race that didn't star Danny Glover. And there are more Glover films beyond that, beyond just what played at the Walker. Interesting films like Flight of the Intruder and the new one, Grand Canyon. So we have a significant presence on stage, and we've got him on the spot, but we'll be kind to him. Let me ask you, since making Places in the Heart 8 years ago, when you were a fairly new actor, I know you made a few films before that, but I'm interested if you can talk about how conditions for black actors has changed between 1984 and now. Conditions meaning the offers that black actors get, and the conditions in which they try to practice their craft.
Well, I certainly think that things have changed. I'm not so sure for actors as it has been for directors, with of course Spike Lee being in the forefront of that change. I know that prior to '84, Denzel did a movie called Carbon Copy, I believe, and had worked a great deal before Places in the Heart. Certainly, as evidenced by the proliferation of the number of black actors, and you notice I didn't mention the word actors, that there's been some some change. There's been some quite I don't know if remarkable change, but if it's remarkable, but it's inevitable. You know, I think that the as you mentioned, the movement and the effect that pop culture, particularly from an African American perspective, has had on society, on the society, has allowed us to find our way into this mainstream to some extent.
Okay, but as a part of the Hollywood mainstream, well, for instance, are you offered more roles now? Or is there more opportunity for you to make films now than there was, say, in 1983?
Well, there are times when I believe they are, and there are times that I believe that we can take whatever we build on in the past and really make a run for it and thrust ourselves into another position and make some real quality films about some other subjects. And then there are times that I myself begin to question that, you know. I know that a lot of my success has been predicated on the fact that I've had successful films, that I've been involved with films, and when Hollywood determines what's a successful film, it's about how much money, how much is returned from the box office. So I know that part of my experience is directly linked to that. I mean, To Sleep with Anger came as a result of the money, the $1.5 million it took to make that film, came with the success primarily of Lethal 2. You know, so I know that's a reality, but I don't know if things are quite easier now than they were. I've been in the process of building a career, having critical success on one hand, and at the same time having some financial success with my film.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'm also interested in is, well, I hope I'm not making an unfair assumption here, which is the assumption that actors all know each other. But I'm guessing that you've got friends who are actors. And
Yes.
I mean, is there...
Of course.
Is their attitude about the business and about opportunity improved, more optimistic than it was, say, 8 years ago or 10 years ago?
Well, I think that there's several factors functioning simultaneously too. One, we cannot play down at all the extent that the economy has had on the opportunities for actors, period. Mm-hmm. You know, we also cannot play down the effect that the let's say subversion with respect to independent films. I mean, it's independent films in a state where it's really difficult to make independent films. That has had some sort of role on opportunities for all of us. That studios tend to lend themselves to an attitude that I want a blockbuster here, or that people aren't going to see films like To Sleep with Anger. People aren't going to see films that are considered nuanced films, or films that have you think, or have you want to ask questions. I mean, all of us, for instance, in Grand Canyon, took a portion of what we normally make in order to get the film made, and that was basically a prerequisite to get that film made. It would have been made for the budget that a Lethal Weapon would be made for, or any other top action film that is almost guaranteed a return. So I'm saying those factors, even though they've had an industry-wide effect, they also have had some impact on whatever's happened to black actors and actresses and minority actors as well.
Oh, okay. Speaking of Grand Canyon and with Grand Canyon, is the building on Grand Canyon, is that alphabetical? I forget.
That's alphabetical.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's
nice sometimes.
That is nice, and actually though, I want to ask you a tough question, which has to do with billing, because I mean, as the co-star of Lethal Weapon, and as the co-star of a lot of significant movies, I remember being very disappointed last summer when I first saw a poster for Pure Luck, which gave Martin Short top billing, first billing.
Yeah.
And I thought, Jesus, what has he got to do? What have you got to do to get top billing? And I'm wondering what that indicates about Hollywood executives' regard of black actors, that they give you such a tough time in regards to billing.
Well, I mean, certainly we've had a tough time in regard to billing. The rap was, of course, that I hadn't done a comedy. That I was that I had done films which have had some overtones, comedic overtones, but I had not done a comedy. And
whereas Martin Short had done that box office thing, Three Amigos.
He had done a comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a point, and I'm sure that we can, because I question that to some degree, how important is billing, and I know it has some relevance, but at the same time, I really want to do this comedy, so I would have to, in order to get this film going, if both parties become so intransient that we run into this roadblock. I had to capitulate basically and take first billing on the foreign market, which is where I'm strong at, on the foreign market, supposedly.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Maybe.
But I mean, it was. I think at the point, at some point, for me, and I have a tough time with this because there are elements of the business that I'm really perhaps astute about than other elements of it that I could really not care a great deal about. And I know that you as a critic, when you see the billing, you at that time determine what the position of that actor is, and what the relationship that actor has to the film, and how important he is to the film, and how much money he received also to some extent.
Yeah.
In relation to that. But at this point, I thought there was a project that I wanted to do, and I certainly wanted to do it, and I didn't want to stand in the way of getting that done.
Yeah, I guess you have to decide what's important and what you're going to actually worry about.
Yeah, I mean, but there may be other times, and there have been other times in my career where I've been adamant about the placement of the billing, and we've gotten what we wanted.
Yeah. Well, it's just that when incidents like that happen, people who are part of the Danny Glover Club automatically notice that something's wrong and something ought to change here.
Yeah.
But I guess
it's very interesting because I have the same issue.
Yeah.
The same issue came up with the film that I'm going to do with. I can tell you these details. It's fun to tell you details in terms of how films work. Film I'm going to do with Matt Dillon, a film about the relationship between two homeless men. Now, David Picker had this film, and David Picker, along with David Putman, at one time ran Columbia, had this film project. It's a wonderful project for the past 5-6 years, and have been unable to get it done. We attached the making of Lethal Weapon with Warner Brothers to getting about half the money to get it done. Warner Brothers wanted me to do Lethal Weapon at a certain point in time. I was planning to do something else, so we asked them to take a third look at the project they had turned down 2 other times, and all of a sudden it was a brilliant film. So we were able to put together half the financing, then we went foreign to get the rest of the financing. Well, and going foreign and spreading ourselves in an effort to get the film, a $7 million film made, which means that Matt and myself would take a cut in our salaries to get it made. But we wanted to do it. We wanted to do the film. We realized that there was, at the end of divvying out this amount of money, divvying out that amount of points, there's 100 points, let's say, 100% of the film, divvying out this and that, and then realizing that there were only a very few points left for Matt, myself, and even David. And so we ended up basically dividing those up equally. We also made a decision, and I made a decision based upon the nature of the project itself, that we would do 50-50 in terms of the positioning of the names. That he would be in place 50% of the time, and I would be in first place 50% of the time, a lead credit 50% of the time. And I guess in that sense, at the time, I didn't feel it so much was a compromise, but I felt it was important to extend that in terms of building some sort of credibility and building the kind of base I thought that we needed, and a viable base we needed to go into this project, to say, let's go half and half. Let's go half, because I think that if we respond that way, if we come into this project with this kind of attitude that we both are making significant sacrifices to do this project, that I think that we'll come out, we'll be very happy with the product. So we don't start off with in the wrong place. And so so just for the integrity of what we were doing, we made that choice. So if you next winter, this coming winter, if you see Danny Glover's name in the second place on the poster, you'll understand the dynamics of that.
So do you mean it's one of these graphic design decisions where your name is on the right, but it's positioned higher than Matt Dillon?
But it's basically the same way that we have it with myself and Lethal. We change names on 50% of the posters.
Oh, that one.
We change, his would be first, and mine would be second, and others, mine would be first, and his would be second. You know. Oh, and you can fight over those things, you know, and really put an argument by that. But I think in some way they get in the way of doing what is essential for me, to doing the work and having the right kind of camaraderie between us at the point in time.
Yeah.
To do the work, and that's important to me, you know, because after it's all said and done, it's the work that matters, you know.
Yeah. Well, the work is very important.
Yeah.
And God, I guess in addition to simply being, in addition to simply being an artist, you know, that as one exists and lives and works as a Black American, you have an additional burden, and part of that additional burden is sort of pushing the mainstream system and structure farther than it's willing to go at the moment. Yeah. You ought to get first billing sometime, and that should be pushed. Because when you think about it in strictly economical terms, Matt Dillon has never appeared in a hit either. So Matt Dillon in essence has earned second place across the country.
I tend to agree with you, and I tend to agree with you from the standpoint that I have to push, and I think there are moments that I determine when it's necessary to push a little bit, and other moments when I necessarily need to push a little harder. No doubt about it. In an effort to get something made that I want to get made, I'm willing to make. Maybe I'm a nice guy, but I'm willing to make some sort of adjustments to get that made.
All right. Well, you know, Matt's a nice guy too, and seriously, and I'm sure Matt would understand. So, anyway, I don't think we've given the audience much background about you. For those few who may not know, I want to read a little bit from the Fox Films bio of Danny, just to tell you where Danny started from. Here we go. A native of San Francisco, Danny Glover attended San Francisco College and trained at the Black Actors Workshop of the American Conservatory Theater.
San Francisco State College.
Okay, thank you. I hope somebody from Fox knows they made a mistake. When I read that part of the bio, I wondered immediately, what was different about the Black Actors Workshop as a part of the American Conservatory Theater?
Well, I think at the time, ACT was trying to justify its funding, the enormous amount of money it was receiving from foundations and perhaps government grants, and so it was their effort at affirmative action. And what made it wonderful is that the training program was essentially the same as the regular training program, is that it allowed people who worked during the day, which I did. I, at the time, was doing I was an evaluation specialist and did a program evaluation for the city and county of San Francisco. And I was an evaluative specialist, so it was impossible for me to do that full time. So it allowed us to work during the day, and I would have classes from 6 to 10, and we often went to midnight on 5 days a week, and then on Saturdays we'd go from about 10 to 6 or 7 in the evening. But I think the same structure, the structure was the same, and it was, although it was a black actors workshop, it was in essence a training program, a training ground for us, and it was at night, so we could work during the day.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Am I correct in assuming that after you got out of the ACT and you did a lot of theater work, did your theater work lead immediately to places in the heart after you did the films like Choo Choo and the Philly Flash and Iceman?
Not necessarily. I mean, I made some really interesting choices. I think. I had from my experience. I mean, the other things that I had done certainly. Because it was a period of time when I didn't act at all. I mean, I stopped acting. I became involved in theater in 1967 when Amiri Baraka came out to San Francisco State, and he walked in the Black Student Union and said that we needed some of you brothers out here to do some of these revolutionary plays. And so I was 20 years old at the time, and so I thought it was my responsibility to be in these plays, and so I was in. And that's in the simplest form. That's the way I got started as an actor. And I auditioned for a play, and I told a bunch of students recently that when I auditioned for the play, there were like a group of us auditioning for several plays. So I picked a play where the least amount of people were auditioning. In fact, there was one guy. I was the only one auditioning for my role. And so it was all right for me. It was all right for me to trip over and stutter over the lines in the audition. And so I got the role because nobody else was auditioning for it. And so, and that was my start, at the time. And I did 2 plays. I did a play called Papa's Daughter and a play by Amiri Baraka called Mad Heart. And all of a sudden, I was the Minister of Culture of the Black Student Union at the time. So that was my intro to acting, and I did some other things. But basically, what happened to me was a man, an actor named Mel Stewart. Most of you would know him from television work. He's done a lot of work in New York. Came out here, and he had worked with the community theater, which did a great deal of improvisation. So after that's about 1978, a year later, Mel tried to develop a group of core group of actors to do improv. I got involved with that core group of actors, and we went to community theaters, community center in the black community, and we were doing improvisation. And most of us were going to school. I was a student at San Francisco State, and we were doing improvisation at night, and we were doing Aikido. We were taking classes in Aikido, so I studied Aikido for a year, just for discipline and concentration. So this is a program Mel had of his intense training for us. So at the end of a period, I left that in 1970, finished school and started working. Did in my internship in city planning at the Berkeley City Planning Department for 6 months, and then came over to city and county of San Francisco and began working there. And about halfway through that, didn't feel I wanted to do something recreational. So around the beginning of 1974, I hooked up with some of the old friends who were with me with Mel, and we started doing improv games and everything which eventually led to me going to the American Conservatory Theater in '75.
Oh, okay.
And I did that. I think two of the significant plays that I did was I played Lenny in a production of Mice and Men in about 1976, and I mean you the things that stay in your mind are periods of how you grow and the manner in which you grow. So I did that. That was the first thing. Then I attached myself in 1976 to a writer who I think I felt more than any other writer wrote for me. And part of it is because of my background as a student activist and involved in the struggles around the African Liberation Support Committee and other things that I had been involved in the early '70s. And it was Athol Fugard, South African playwright. And once I read Blood Knot, acting took on a whole nother meaning for me. You know, I mean, I was able to combine the kind of political agitprop plays that we did, in the late '60s, and the kind of information theater that we ascribed to.
You carried it over
into something that was the work in the language was so wonderful. So I began to work on accents, dialects, a South African accent, and working on Blood Knot. And it led eventually to doing Sizwe Banzi is Dead with someone from here. His sister is here with Carl Lumley, who's from Minneapolis here. We did Sizwe Banzi is Dead in 1977. We ended up in the Fluke touring campuses and for the California Arts Program that year, and then we ended up in Los Angeles and got agents and ended up doing The Island in 1978. And The Island in some ways indirectly brought me to New York in 1979 to do the Blood Knot off Broadway at the Roundabout. Athol Fugard walked in to a rehearsal for about 20 minutes during that run. And 2 years later, in January of '82, he called me and asked me to come to Yale Rep to do Master Hair on the Boys. And he remembered me from the run-through of Blood Knot. Robert Benton saw Master Hair on the Boys at the opening at Yale Rep and met me about a year, called me in about a year and a half later, and because he thought I could be his Mose for places and all.
That sounds like progressive development. Well, since you did so much of Fugard, I'm wondering what it was in his writing that interested you.
Well, I struggle. Basically that, the fact that sometimes you don't get an opportunity, you're not presented with an opportunity to say what you feel about the world or whose side you're on in the world in your work. And I felt so liberated in a way to be able to do a play like The Island and say, this is what I feel. These issues are important to me, or a play like Sizwe Banzi is Dead. And doing plays like that, in some way, you elevate your own humanity. And I think that's what Fugard allowed me to do. He allowed me to work on I think, work that was profound. The language was profound. The consistency in the story, in the relationships, I found wonderful as an acting exercise, And they were often two-character plays, and he often, since he was influenced sometimes by Grotowski, allowed me. There was a minimalist process in which he used with that, and I found it just wonderful to work on, and it was challenging. And so, but mainly the one thing it was allowed me to make my statement, or determine how I can make my statement about the world through his work.
Yeah, but it sounds like you have a complete emotional and artistic engagement with his plays.
Yeah.
What happens when you go to Hollywood? Can you find material in Hollywood that that interest you to the same degree?
Well, you often do, or you find ways that you try to elevate the material. You know, I mean, that's what you do. You elevate the material in a way. All of a sudden, Places in the Heart was my grandfather's story. You know, who and my grandparents, who were sharecroppers when they were married more than 75 years ago, and became tenant farmers and owned their own farm. Mose became the picture I saw of my grandfather as a child, coming up and visiting him during the summer. So I was able to use him in a sense and elevate that. It became a tribute. My work became a tribute to my mother, who was part of that continuum. I'm a part of the continuum that I am a part of. You know, who left, who picked cotton, and who somehow got to Payne College, and then in furthering her dreams, moved out to the West Coast and had a family that I became a part of. So there are ways in which you can take the work and make it meaningful in a way. Certainly there's no question about the work doing Mandela. I read No Easy Walk to Freedom when I was 20 years old in 1967. So, I mean, it was as if I had was preparing myself to do Mandela for so many years, you know, for 20 years before I actually did it, you know. So there are ways in which you do it, and sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult. But a role like the film To Sleep with Anger allowed me to revisit some of the things some of the stories that I knew, some of the experiences and stories told to me by my grandmother, or things that I heard, or people that I saw, and so those kind of things be able to kind of bring alive.
Yeah. Okay. Those are remarkable films, actually. Those that you mentioned.
Silverado. I mean, you know, Lawrence Kasdan came to me. What's so endearing was Lawrence Kasdan knew the meaning of multiculturalism in some way. He came to me and said, "Hey man, I've always wanted to do a Western with a black hero in it." And he didn't say to me, a black Western. I mean, we know there have been black Westerns when we made race films in the 30s and 40s, you know. But he knew to some extent the contributions that African Americans made to the West, you know. So when he came to me and said that, it developed our relationship there. We went and did Silverado.
Yeah. Well, you've worked with a number of serious filmmakers, and filmmakers whose sense of American history and American society is admirable, and these are rare people, I think. Mm-hmm. Though not all of them, I think, can make the kind of imaginative leap into the minds and experiences of black people as Fugard has in his plays, but some of them come real close. I think Places in the Heart comes very close, at least in the scenes with Mose. And I think we have a clip from that we can look at and then talk about this particular scene and what's going on in Places in the Heart. Perhaps talk about how you were able to move from serious theater to serious films. Well, that's a very good scene. Well, let me ask you, a kind of a technical question. Was there any improvisation going on there at all?
Yeah. God. It was a lot of that was improv, you know, from the counting, the circling, and everything. It's I remember my feet were cold that morning. And it's always a hard film to me, and I can't.
Well, you know, I think I think your reaction is the reaction a lot of people had when they saw it. It's a very moving film because I think it's also a very complex film. When I said before that it was a movie that looked at the past from a modern point of view, I think that is a complicated thing to do, and it's a rare thing to do. I myself think.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, that's okay.
It took me about, I think about 2 years to see. I've never seen this film in its entirety, but it took me about 2 years to look at most of it. I said it was a tribute to my mom. My mom died the day I found out I was going to do this role. So and I think I spent most of the time crying. God, I spent most of the time crying. I think I ended up crying that morning when we started shooting. That's when my feet were probably cold. I'm laughing at the same time because every time I think I see this, or think about this film, or think about I think it's a photograph that shows me looking one of the publicity photos, and it's, I'd always think about this incredible woman that was in my life. And so, it's, God, you think that you go past it after eight, 9 years almost, but you seem like it, it just, but we did a lot of improv in that moment, actually the rabbit foot wasn't part of it. The rabbit foot was part of the improvisation. Okay. And introducing the rabbit foot, take this rabbit foot, and they subsequently give me my rabbit foot back. But Hankton, the young boy, was such a jewel. He's such an innocent. He said, "Hey, yes sir, yes ma'am, yes sir, yes ma'am, yes sir, and yes ma'am, you're there." He was such a wonderful young man. But it was interesting because, it was a difficult film from the standpoint, given the relationship that we'd had historically with cotton, and the farm and everything. But Benton, and then as I said, and I told Benton, later that I thought that we made a contribution to humanity. We made a contribution to humanity doing this film. It remains the film closest to me, and I doubt if any other film will ever bring me as close to me. Let me share something with you. My mother, in April that year, on a ride back from, we were going somewhere. It was a long drive back, and she began to talk to me. My mother, she was just incredible. She would go see a tarot card reader. She would have her cards read or whatever. And so she said, "You're going to do a film in September. That's going to be one of the most important films in your life." And she told me this, and she said, "The film is going to be about you in a sense." In a sense, she said, about you, and I was able to, and I didn't know what she was talking about then. I had not met Benton at that particular point in time, but she was telling me this is what the woman had told her when she said that your son is going to do an important film, and this important film is going to be about him and who he is, in a sense, and what he's about, in a sense. And that came to pass. She didn't tell me she wasn't going to be here to look at it, but yeah. And so that happened in April of that year, 1983.
Yeah. Well, the spirituality in Places in the Heart is one of the most fascinating things about it. In particular, I'm interested in that scene about the talismans and charms, I guess, that you're nailing on the wall. Whose contribution was that to the film?
Well, That was also in part my contribution. I had. I mean, I've come up, even though I grew up and was born and raised in San Francisco, I came up through so many stories. I remember so many stories my grandmother would tell me, you know. Of just fascinating stories, you know, that you would believe almost. For instance, all the women in my on my mother's side, her sister and my grandmother, have always had problems with their legs, very close, but they all have gorgeous legs. My mother had gorgeous legs, and my grandmother's gorgeous legs, my aunt, but they all had problems with their legs. So my grandmother tells me the story of how my aunt had the problems with her legs. Now, there's no medical. This is not related to medicine at all, at all. You know, but it's in her mind. This is her. So she says that one day the three children were playing, and my grandfather and her went off somewhere, and they were playing house, and someone had put something to do great harm to my grandfather in his boots. And my aunt playing the grandfather, playing her father, and they were playing house, put on the boots, and fell ill after she had put on the boots. In fact, she had to give her, she had to take her to Big Mama, my grandfather's mother, who was an herbist, and who was a healer, and heal her because they couldn't get the boots off, and the boots did something to her legs, and she couldn't walk for a while. This is my grandmother recounting how my aunt's legs, when she has problems with her legs now, she has real problems with her legs at 70 some odd years old. So I mean, I those stories, and either hearing them from my mother, through my grandmother, was part of what I came up through. You know, I was the first generation to be not born on the farm.
Yeah. Well, when I said that spirituality is an important part of this movie, in the scene that we just saw, there seems to be a combination of kind of some vestige of African religion and Christianity as well.
Yeah.
And then for those who saw Places in the Heart, you know, it ends with a kind of remarkable and surreal sort of a Christian resurrection.
Yes.
And can you talk about how that came about? And what that scene was actually intended to say, and how you went about filming it?
Certainly the ending of that, communion that takes place at the end, that my feeling about it is that we're all children of God, and we all it's about forgiveness. I think so. For me, that seems about forgiveness. And essentially, since the communion is about forgiveness and forgiveness of one's sins, that's what that scene.
Oh, okay. Well, it's very interesting, especially in light of the personal story you relate about it. I know when it seems to me that when one experiences a loss, it's sometimes one of the deepest feelings you can have is the idea or the hope of seeing that person again, which is what happens at the end of the movie. The characters who are lost in A Place in the Heart are brought back.
Yes.
And brought back in a way that's simply a spiritual wish.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's it's a very profound ending, and it sort of relates to the story that you told us about your mother's prediction about that film.
Yes.
That by acting through your own Moses' own resurrection, in a sense, you bring to life your mother's prediction.
Yes.
That's interesting. That makes it even more moving. Okay. Uh, I would guess that in working with Robert Benton, that who is a smart filmmaker, that you were able to experience something like the kind of intuitive understanding with an artist that you have when you work in a Fugard play.
Yes,
I'm guessing.
yes, absolutely.
And so I want to ask you about working with white artists, and I guess white artists of a liberal bent. Do you think that they're able to do what they do through, I guess, guilt or compassion or insight?
Well, it certainly it depends upon the artist. I would believe that Benton's ability to be sensitive to who I am, what I'm about, came primarily as an expression of his own understanding, compassion in a sense. Mm-hmm. And when I talked about Lawrence Kasdan and his approach to me when I did Silverado, I felt basically the same way, that he felt comfortable enough with who he was in his own humanity, that he would allow me to express what I felt about mine. I don't always find that to be the case with all directors. I find, and literally, I find that often you run into the problem with white directors of allowing you to do what you want to do because they don't want to stand in the way of it. They don't want to make any kind of take any risks. I think that they have to take risks, and they have to allow themselves to understand and also to have that compassion. I don't often run into the situation that I run into with particularly the Lawrence Kasdans and the Robert Bentons.
Yeah. Moses has a second big scene in Places in the Heart, which comes at the end of the film. In the story of the film, Moses is an itinerant worker who goes to work for the widowed Sally Field and helps her bring in her cotton crop. And in the course of the story, the Ku Klux Klan rises and they assault Mose and run him out of town. And there's a farewell scene between you and Sally Field. And the dialogue in that scene is kind of strange, I always thought, and I always had kind of an ambivalent response to it. So I'd like to hear what your ideas on that scene is. It's where Moses is dejected, and he's saying goodbye to Sally Field, and then she tells him that you are the man who brought in the crop, that it's all because of you that we have this success that we've had, and more or less wherever you go, don't you forget that. And I always when I first saw the film, I felt that there's something wrong in what she's saying, that maybe she should be saying, I won't forget that. And I'm curious as to how you played that scene and what those lines meant for you.
I'm curious too. I try to remember what were my motivations in that scene. I heard at the same time in her performance that I won't forget that. I may have heard her say, "You don't forget that," but I heard, "I won't forget that." And I'm not so sure. Thinking now, if we shot it both ways, I can't remember right now.
Well, that.
Yeah, which was a very, very, very point that I felt that in the performance that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you felt and heard compassion, at least in her performance.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, I have an ambivalent response to that, and the other response I have to it is that what's plainly gone for in that dialogue is her character's understanding that you are dejected, that you are giving up. And she's trying at that point to offer Mose some encouragement to keep going by telling him, "Don't you forget that."
Well, I don't think Mose, certainly that Mose had found something very special in his life and discovered something in this encounter. But I think ultimately Mose knew he had to go. He knew he had to move on. I think that reality for him was certainly. I mean, he didn't have any dilemmas about that. He had to move on. He had to go on.
Yeah.
You know, but that certainly doesn't diminish him in any way at all. It certainly doesn't make him less than because he didn't stay there to confront that, but he understood the peculiar reality that he lived in. You know, I remember giving interviews about that film and talking to my grandfather, mentioning stories of my grandfather, maybe about 2 years before, talking to me about fear, about living in a rural area in Georgia and having to in some ways acquiesce to the reality of that. I didn't think any less than that. I remember going down there as a young child, a teenager, doing the height of the whole civil rights movement, sit-ins, and being angry and not being and certainly being arrogant and angry coming from the North, believing that these people were complacent and they didn't want to change, and often abruptly in let's say 1962, walking into the front of a door at 15 years old of a place of a truck stop down the road from the house, no more about 100 yards, about 250 yards from the house, and walking in when it clearly said that blacks in the back, niggers in the back, colors in the back. I remember doing that, arguing with the sales clerk on another occasion while down there. But certainly when he talked about fear and having to acquiesce in some way, having to maintain and go on, I understood that. I think Mose understood that as well.
Yeah. Well, certainly one interesting thing about Mose is that, and why I date things from your appearance in Places in the Heart, is that it's one of the first contemporary black characters, or black characters in a contemporary film, who seems to have an inner life, who seems to have something that isn't always shown on the screen. Mm-hmm. He seems to have something inside him, which is quite a difference from the kind of roles that Sidney Poitier played so wonderfully. Usually in Poitier's films, he made beautiful simply the surface that he was allowed to show. But I think there's a conception to Mose, and there's something that you bring out when you play Mose that isn't always shown. It's simply suggested. There's a subtext to Mose, and I think that makes a difference in that character.
Well, I mean, perhaps the subtext to Mose is also the subtext to Willie from Master Harold and the Boys. That despite the situation, they're able to kind of maintain a part of their humanity.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to move on now to the second significant film of your career, or what I call the second significant film, which would be The Color Purple, and a controversial film, to say the least.
Yes. I think y'all came to talk about The Color Purple again, huh?
Oh, that's all right, because we can talk about it. Because I think it's the pivotal American movie on blackness as a film subject. I mean, it's not perhaps an inspiration for Spike Lee, but I think it prepared the mainstream for movies in which blacks are a romantic screen presence, romantic in the generic sense. I think it's a great film, actually, and I'm curious as to how you respond to the controversy that film provoked.
How I did or how I do?
Well, how do you actually? That's more interesting. How do you think it was done?
I was, I think from and I made a great deal of, I made a bunch of statements, but not a lot of people talked to me about that, you know. Either their response was that they were afraid to talk to me and afraid to anger me about it or something. I don't know. But whenever I did say something about it, I tried to place it in some sort of historical context, the story itself. Frantz Fanon talks about the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. The colonized and the colonizer. Farrar wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about the relationship between the haves and the have-nots and power, and so if you want to think about the relationship, I mean, I understood that first of all, Mister's liberation was intricately linked to Celie's liberation. So you know, I felt that you had two people in the process of liberating themselves, and that was my approach. Even in scenes, even in choices that I made, that I felt that often Mister's behavior or action might be decisive, but his behavior was ambiguous, you know, and the reasons why he did it. First, I remember seeing of the dilemma that he had in hitting Celie for the first time, I remember. And I think I wanted to build a character who was struggling with himself as well. You know, I mean, for me as an actor to say that the character behavior is bad, or to be subjective and to say that his character is bad and it's self-defeating anyway. I get nowhere with that. The process I use is determining what a character wants, what he needs, and then moving from there, and allow the audience to determine what is social behavior, how that behavior manifests itself, and I then put the label on him.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's look at a first clip from The Color Purple.
But what I said basically, and I felt that the discourse and the discussion about the Color Purple was important. I felt that the film was a vehicle in which African Americans were able to express their discontent, not only with what they felt was wrong with that film, but our whole legacy, our whole involvement in film in this country. So the Color Purple represented that vehicle for me, and I was more than happy for it. I would have been disappointed if there wasn't any discussion or that kind of, I think, healthy. Even though I disagree with some of the analysis, but I certainly thought the discussion, the discourse was healthy.
Well, it is America.
Yeah.
And I certainly like what you said about presenting a character that you conceived carefully, and letting the audience think about it, but actually giving them the responsibility of actually thinking about it rather than having a knee-jerk response. Let's look at the first clip from The Color Purple and think seriously about that. Well, I think that The Color Purple is as structurally sophisticated a film as Places in the Heart, and actually, I think even more so. I think what we see in the two scenes we just looked at is a kind of a very interesting and very modernist use of archetypes. If you think about the first scene where Mr. is being quite brutal to the two girls, and you think about it in terms of movie history, which is always the right thing to do when approaching modernist film, the obvious referent there is to Griffith, and if any of you have seen Griffith's Orphans of the Storm, and you think about the separation and reunion scenes between the two sisters there, the same kind of gut level emotional power there. And also in the second scene where Celie spits into the glass of water, that's also a kind of modernist reference to what Kissy does in Roots, if any of you remember that. What happens in The Color Purple, I think, the way Spielberg uses the archetypes in those two films, is to get audiences used to thinking about the way emotions and the way black people have been depicted in popular culture. And I think those ideas are at work in the movie. And they're at work, I think, in an interesting way in depicting the character that Danny plays, in depicting Mr. In the first sequence, we see a kind of just sheer brutality. And then in the second scene, that's explained for any of us who have a question about it. And it's explained quite interestingly as brutal Mr.'s own emasculation by his father, which is like, an emasculation through patriarchy. A complex and interesting idea. That's how I look at it. I'm interested in how you approached playing Mr. in this film, Danny.
Well, as I said, I mean, the key operatives in this, and looking at this again, certainly Mr. loved Sugar Avery. Perhaps Mr. And at some point worshipped her liberation, and may have attached in some way his own liberation to her liberation. I know that I saw Mr. as being also abused in his own sense, his own way of being abused. I think as typified by this particular scene of the relationship that he had with his father. As I said, in structuring and structuring the character, I certainly played on his complexities as well as his vulnerability, and I felt that, as I said before, that I felt that he himself was tortured in a way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also, as you said before, about Mr.'s struggle towards liberation being tied in with Celie's struggle towards liberation. And there's also another wonderful scene that you have in the movie that we don't have time to show, where Mr. and Celie are getting up from bed and they both have colds. And there's a wonderful kind of choreography between you and Whoopi Goldberg as you both try to put on your pajamas, and also as you come outdoors and you both sniffle at the same time. If you all saw the movie, and if you all remember that sequence, it's quite a nice bit of interplay between the two of you.
Yes.
That actually does play out how their humanity is intertwined.
Yes.
How their struggle, how their illness is intertwined too.
Yes.
Also in the Color Purple, I think it's a remarkable film because it also adds a dimension to how Hollywood movies depict the idea of black families and the kind of dynamics and emotional tensions that go on within a family. Mm-hmm. And this is a way to seg into your biggest commercial success, which was Lethal Weapon.
Yes.
That's a film that I found interesting. I found it enjoyable as an action movie, of course, but especially interesting in terms of the character you played, Roger Murtaugh, and Roger Murtaugh's family life. In preparing the notes for tonight's evening, I wrote that in Lethal Weapon we had Hollywood's first example of a black middle-class family. And someone at Walker said, "Is that true?" I said, "Yeah, it's strange, but true." And
I would credit you for that. I think that's also part of what makes your career significant, because you do have that kind of change in a Hollywood movie. So can we look at that clip from Lethal Weapon and then talk about it? So that was also your debut as a rap artist, right?
Yeah.
Well,
This is the first time I saw this. I haven't seen this film. I never saw this movie.
what kept you from it?
Really, it's often difficult to look at the stuff that I do. Yeah, I mean, and there's probably a couple other things that you have on there I haven't seen either. So don't be surprised. I'm looking at it for the first time, really, in a sense. I remember doing it and remember what went into the moment. But certainly there's a certain Cosby-esque tendencies there. And but certainly the humor that I find in my own family life, and certainly that I experienced even in my growing up. There was a great deal of humor we were aspiring middle class, my family, my mother and father, but there's so much humor in there, you know. I think the relationship, it was easy to attach myself because I have a daughter, and I think the relationship with Rianne mirrors the relationship that I have with my daughter.
Well, you know, it's interesting also, you talked about working on the Fugard plays, and your interest in those plays being that their depiction of struggle.
Yeah.
And also, unexpectedly, in the middle of Lethal Weapon, in the middle of the scene, we have that bumper sticker about ending apartheid on the refrigerator.
Yeah.
I think things like that appear in movies with significance. Actually.
Yeah.
Whose idea was that?
Oh, this my idea.
Well, that's fair. That's cool. It's funny about a movie like Lethal Weapon, which is basically an action film. You know, as a black viewer, sometimes, you know, we watch action movies and you wonder about the roles that black actors have in those films, usually as cannon fodder, and usually as the person who doesn't do the action. And even in Lethal Weapon, Mel Gibson gets to do all the daring to do, all the stunts.
Absolutely.
But also, which is well, your insurance company is glad of that too, I'm sure. But in a way, it seems unfair. But then in this film, what's significant about it, I think, is that there is a kind of trade-off, because for the first time in an action movie, you have a black family featured in this way, and the black family at the heart of Lethal Weapon becomes what the heroes are fighting to save. They become the emblem of American society and of American ideas and virtue, and that's a first too, actually.
Well, the other thing is that we bring Martin into our world. You know, I bring him into my family. I make him a part of that. Usually it's often the other way around.
Yeah, and he comes into a black American family and is, in a sense, healed by their example of love and humor.
Yeah, and I try to, and the other part of this, I mean, and we know the statistics in terms of, we often hear the statistics in terms of policemen and their lives once they take the uniform off, when they're not behind in the car. I wanted to, I remember the beginning of this scene, and I'll say it in a moment. I wanted to bring the kind of release or the kind of joy or the kind of, here's a man who was able to leave that part of his life behind and come on and elevate himself to another different experience. Mm-hmm. You know, I remember shooting this, the beginning scene which was all improvisation with the kids, which was my daughter, or you are, and all that. It was all improvisation. And Dick Donner came over to me and whispered, "What you been smoking, man?" He thought that I had, but I wanted to bring that element to that, and even though they had been through this hard period where someone had died and their lives were on the line, that he brought some other kind of energy to his family, and that became his focal point.
Was he serious when he asked you that question?
You know, it was real funny. I think he was serious.
Oh, well, then that would explain the toilet scene in the second before.
But he really said, Dick said, hey man, what you been smoking? Because he thought I was, I mean, it was really something, like I said, it was improvisation and it was like acting silly, which I tend to do. My daughter would attest to that I'm a big kid and I tend to act very silly. You know, so I think it was acting silly. And not only that, I think that for me, that mirrors the relationship also that I find with young kids that are in my neighborhoods. I mean, and live in the neighborhood I live in. There's a little 6-year-old girl that said, "Danny Glover, where you going?" Every time I come out and look, I got a suitcase in my hand. She's almost 7. I said, "Danny Glover, where you going?" You know, that's what I went.
All right. Well, then I think we know who.
So they contribute. They're the life that I experienced in my own life. It contributed, and those little kids contributed to that original moment in that scene.
So you brought it back to.
I brought it back to. Yeah.
Good. Well, then we know who to credit the values of that movie too.
Yeah.
Not Mr. Donner. Let's move on to A Raisin in the Sun, which sort of gives added credibility to the idea to my idea, I guess, that your career is an example of someone who could use Sidney Poitier as a trampoline and go on. That's not to disparage Poitier at all, but just to go on from his advances and to do even more, you know, from the place that he started from. Can we see the clip from Raisin in the Sun?
I do. So it's like I come from the stage and almost seeing the thing becomes anticlimactic for me. So that was all my slobber.
Well, I guess the second.
I didn't understand what they were saying. I realized that slobber sure was nasty. All right.
That's what they call a juicy performance. Well, I guess the second question that people would ask is, what do you do after an emotional outburst like that? Do you go to sleep, or do you go run a mile, or what?
Well, I thought that I continued on. We did some more to play, but I mean, in remembering, there was nothing nice about Walter Lee's pain, you know, and I remembered after going through that, because I thought, just as an overview, I'd never read A Raisin in the Sun, and believe me, at all, prior to doing this film. How I became and got through acting without Raisin in the Sun is a very interesting story as an African American actor. When I began doing theater, Lorena Hansberry was considered passé. In fact, I think Amiri Baraka wrote a very interesting article about apologizing to Lorena Hansberry. So I went through the period not seeing the play or reading the play. In fact, this secret of mine was that I didn't read the play at all in its entirety to the first day of rehearsal. I wanted to be informed by what happened at that moment, the spontaneity that happened at that moment on the first day of rehearsal, as opposed to setting an agenda before that. You know, I know that everyone and his mama had done A Raisin in the play. Raisin in the Sun. So I wanted to be informed by what was happening between us and each one of those each one of the individuals playing that role in each role. So I didn't read. That was my preparation, not to read the play at all until the first day of rehearsal.
How did you decide to? Why did you decide to do it in that case?
Because, you know how you believe in something and feel a part of something, even though you have no idea. The resonance that Raisin in the Sun left with you, just by its name, just by reading Langston's poetry, was so empowering in itself. It was so incredible in itself that I didn't need to read the play to understand the profound impact it had on me as an African American. It went beyond being theater. It transcended theater in a way that no other play written by an African American has, and it became our experience. That's what makes it so timeless. So I wanted to do it from that standpoint, and I was asked to do it initially. I was asked to do it, and there was another director was attached to it, and then and that other director backed out, and then I told the people that the only way that I would do this play was to have Bill Duke direct it, because there was something about Bill, and Bill and I had known each other since I did an episode of Palmerstown, but it was something about Bill and what we discussed at the time that made me feel that no one could bring, I think Bill and everyone I think everyone in that cast, including myself, would tell you that Bill was the one who brought out those performances and made Esther as wonderful as she was, and made all of us realize, or all of us become something extraordinary. But I said I'll do it only if Bill Duke directs it, because something about his sensibility, something about him that I, just from talking with him, and just from knowing who he was and our friendship, I felt that he could bring something very, very wonderful to it.
Yeah, isn't it strange how across time ideas about culture change? That Hansberry's writing was considered at one point to be passé, as you say, and also to be an untruthful or not even an Uncle Thomas view of black people, and then we come around to see the essential truth of her play.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And that truth, which is truth about family, is like the consistent Danny Glover theme, actually. Yeah. And so many of your best films, that's what they're about.
Yeah. But I think what my overview of that was that like I said, that wasn't. I mean, Walter Lee's dream was bigger than himself in a way. Mm-hmm. And for me, when I thought about that play, when I think about that play after doing it, his dream was, and his need, his wanting to empower himself, was all the dreams of all those who came before us. They were all the dreams of those bones that are scattered on the floor of the Atlantic. They were their dreams. So the frustration in that it was bigger too, and then more intense in a way. I felt,
Yeah, it takes on a mythic dimension.
Yeah,
than the man.
It's bigger than the man. It's bigger than the man.
Hmm. All right.
There's nothing nice and cute about it. It's ugly.
Oh, it's real.
It's real.
Okay, let's. Can we see the two clips from To Sleep with Anger, which is, I would say, like your ultimate expression of African American family life. That's the film you made in 1990 with Charles Burnett.
Charles Burnett.
All right, can you talk about how you came to make To Sleep with Anger? I think you're also credited as an associate producer on that film.
I was co-executive director. I'm a co-executive producer on that. Co-executive producer.
And it represents, I think, a significant change in terms of your career, in that you're not just acting anymore, or not only acting anymore, but also producing the films you make. And how did you come to move into the other area of filmmaking? And how did you meet Charles Burnett?
Well, first of all, I met Charles Burnett at a screening in 1984 of My Brother's Wedding in San Francisco at the San Francisco Film Festival. You know, you do the courteous thing. I hope that we'll get a chance to work together sometime. Interesting enough, I was filming A Lonesome Dove in Del Rio, Texas, and a friend of mine, a young woman who is wonderful in her own way. I didn't know she was a director when I met her. When Carl Lumley and I were doing The Island in LA in 1978, when I met her, she was directing a play. She brought 2 projects to me, and she said to me, "These are the kind of projects I think you should be doing." One of the projects she brought to me was To Sleep with Anger. The other one was a thing I did with called Dead Men Out, which I did for HBO with Ruben Blades. And I read the film. I read the script. I remember that night, and I was staying, for the lack of a place to stay, on a houseboat. And I remember sitting out that night and being moved by almost something in the same way in which my mother was moved, probably when she told me that you're going to do a film that's going to be important in a way. And I was moved by what I felt when I read that script. I was so moved. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain why I was moved in that way. And so the film in some way allowed me to experience what I was moved by, if that makes any sense. Sometimes you don't know things, and sometimes you never find out things. But the film gave me an opportunity, a process that I can emotionally perhaps understand what I didn't understand. I'm not saying that I learned to understand anything, but I used the film, for me, was that process. But there's so much I knew, but I didn't understand. I mean, it's like sometimes we talk about a child when he comes out of the womb. He comes into, it was a scene in this film that depicts, he comes into the world knowing everything and then goes through the process of forgetting it all. You know, and basically, there were 2 instances in this film, if you never saw this film, the one where Harry touches the pregnant woman's stomach and the baby kicks, you know, or the little boy who becomes his nemesis in some sort of sense, who sweeps the broom off his feet. You know, they knew something about him. And I wanted to, in a way, maybe viscerally, in some sort of way, and maybe, I don't know, I wanted to try to understand that, you know.
Yeah, how did you become the co-executive producer?
It was a perfect opportunity. We had been searching for money to do the film for some time. Sony, we approached Sony, and Sony provided us the money. Sony at the time is out in New York, and so I found an opportunity to be a little bit closer. And I think it came with, also coupled with the experience that I had on Lethal 2. I just finished Lethal 2 prior to that. And sometimes when you do an action film, you become so disjointed and disassociated from what's going on, because there's so much special effects and so much action and so much stunts and all those kind of things, and there were plenty of those. And I felt, even though I was able to work on the acting part of it, that I wasn't able to kind of maintain a focus on all the other stuff that was happening there. And so, because I don't get into stunts that much. I mean, I'll do them, but I couldn't choreograph a stunt for you, you know, at all, you know, or because it doesn't do anything for me. And so I distance myself for it when I go in my trailers. Someone said today to me, and go to sleep sometimes if I didn't have to do the stunt, if my stunt double did. So I wanted to be close to a film, in the making of a film, within mind, thinking that perhaps producing would be something that I want to do.
Yeah. Are you going to work with Burnett again?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Charles and I have a project that we're working on now, I've certainly, as many times as I can.
Well, you know, when the results of working with an independent filmmaker like Charles Burnett, when the results are as fine as this one and as successful as this, does it ever make you wonder if Hollywood should be forsaken? If you should just simply work with independent filmmakers from now on, or? Well,
I mean, like I said, the reality is, outside of, I sometimes do. The success of my action films allows it a bit easier to get the financing to do some of the, however small the financing is, to do some of the independent films, do some of the projects.
Because you're more bankable.
Well, you're able to get the money from Sony. You're able to get we made this film for $1.5 million, which is, as you know, not a great deal of money in terms of a film, but you're able to get the money. I mean, we were able to get the money for The Saint of Fort Washington, my next film, based upon the success of those blockbusters, or the potential of those blockbusters.
But what about you see, when you think about the clip that we just saw from To Sleep With Anger, and think about it in terms of, the clip from Places in the Heart, and the repetition of some motifs in there, like the rabbit's foot. And the whole spectral aspect of To Sleep With Anger, the spirituality and the portents that occur throughout To Sleep With Anger. I mean, those are the kind of things that just are not explored or looked at in commercial films. It seems that unless you're going to get a filmmaker like Robert Benton, that the only way you can work on that kind of material is if you work outside the mainstream with a Charles Burnett.
Well, certainly. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's. I would hope that and what I've tried to do is to do both of those things, to work with the Charles Burnett's or perhaps the John Singletons, you know, who are able or allow themselves to a different expression, a way of expressing themselves.
Is there a different kind of communication between you and a black filmmaker such as Burnett, or, as you mentioned before, Bill Duke?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, without a doubt, you know. I mean, for instance, Bill and I, in working on Raising the Sun, and trying to personalize the struggle of Walter Lee, we talked about our backgrounds, you know, as men who were either too big or too black or too unattractive all our lives, and feeling too awkward in a sense, and how we can bring some of our own our feeling of ourselves and our own inadequacies at some time to the role. I mean, we're always trying to find a way in which, as in the acting term would be, to substitute an experience, our own experience in the role, in using ourselves. Because as actors, we use ourselves first. And I remember being able to talk with Bill about that experience as kids growing up, of feeling dumb at times. There were times in my life that I felt dumb, you know. And Bill would tell me the story about how he took French in college, and he took it 3 times, and his grade got worse. He said, you know, and how dumb he felt, you know. I mean, so we could talk about our own struggle to create or to build some self-esteem in ourselves and use that, you know, in a way. Or Charles and I could talk about our experiences growing up with our relationships with our grandmother. It's not saying that Benton and I could have been able to talk about that, but it was the road to doing that was a less, it's a much easier road to walk on.
Yeah.
And so that it's been for me. I mean, and I said that I've worked with 2 very gifted and very sensitive African American directors. You know, Bill Duke.
Well, certainly, I would think that the tendency in working with black artists is to turn around the kind of stereotypes that films presented of black people in the past.
Absolutely.
And even to correct the kind of misrepresentation that's gone on, and also as you say about turning a sense of self into a virtue. I just think about there's a Spinners song, in fact, where Felipe Wynn sang about, there's a love song where he sang about in my big black arms is where you belong.
Yeah.
And just the tendency to do that thing, which is natural for black artists, is the kind of thing you can only get from another black artist, and so you're sort of better off working with them.
Yeah.
I say that because in Bill Duke's A Rage in Harlem, you have a small part in that, but like your role in To Sleep with Anger, there are a few more dimensions, a few more colors in that role than you've been able to play in most other films. And if we can we look at that clip from A Rage in Harlem and show you just what I mean? Well, I would trust that playing that part was as much fun as it is to watch.
It was fun. It was. You have another clip from that? It was fun.
Oh, we could. I don't think we have time, unfortunately. But you know, what I find of interest about what you do in that scene and that you do so well is that Easy Money, that's the character you play.
Easy Money, yeah.
He's like the suave side of Harry Mention, your character in Sleep with Anger. And then at the same time, it's sort of like there's corruption to him too, but that's underneath. But it's refreshing, and it's interesting to see you get to play something, to play emotions that are a bit lighter and wittier than most other films.
Yeah. Stay in a hotel.
Stay in a hotel. I don't know. Have you ever read any of?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Oh yeah. Definitely Chester's work. Oh, absolutely.
You think you might do any other adaptations?
It'd be interesting. You know, I remember one time, and I thought this would have been very interesting. That Columbia at the time that David Putnam was the chairman was going to do Real Cool Killers, and which is another Chester Hines piece, and the director attached to it was Volker Slondorf, which I thought was very interesting. Volker Slondorf was the director of The Tin Drum, which I thought was an amazing film, and I was interested, and they had asked me, and they approached me about doing it. I was really excited about that, seeing what that kind of collaboration would have brought about, you know. Certainly, Bill shines as a director in this. He really just is very delicate with this, you know.
Yeah.
Well, and for him, it's a love story. It's a love story, you know. Beyond the other kind of stuff, it's a love story.
Well, you know, Volker Slondorf sometimes makes things kind of stiff, but Bill Duke he's at least tuned into the actors, and all of you, Forrest Whitaker and especially Robin Givens, are just especially good in this movie. And
Are you always this kind in your reviews, brother?
Always this honor. Well, listen, as a critic, you know, we try not to. I try not to give false compliments, so that when I give one, it's taken seriously. And I mean, you've worked with some good directors, and you know, you've worked with better directors than Schlondorf. But anyway, we run long, but I think right here we can break for a few questions from the audience. This is a good place to break, I think, after the scene of Easy Money, where Danny Glover has his most star-like appearance. So, with that encouragement, have we got time for a few questions? Okay, we'll take a few. Yes.
Do you have any intention on directing anything in the future?
Any intentions to direct?
Any intentions to direct? I suppose I think about that sometimes, but not a great deal. I'm so enamored. I mean, I really get excited about acting still, you know, and I don't think I'm presumptuous enough to think that I can act and direct at the same time. I don't know. Someone once, a teacher once said that when a student approached him and the student asked him that he wanted to be a director, and he told the student to close his eyes, and the student closed his eyes, and he said, he asked the student what he saw, and the student saw nothing. And the teacher said, "Come back to me when you see something." When I close my eyes and I really see something, I think I'll direct. I'll try to do.
Oh, geez. Okay, right here.
How did you make the transition from stage to cinema, and what differences do you find in the techniques you have to use in stage and cinema?
Well, certainly when I talk about the process you go through with building a character, building the character's life, building his background, that goes across the board. That you do that in stage, you do that in cinema as well. I don't know if, I mean, I used to be, when I first began, a purist, and I thought that I was going to do stage, and that was going to be my forte. So I tend to lean toward not having a favorite, you know, at this particular point. And the transition, believe me, it's not real difficult for me. The relationships that happen are the same. The focus is the same. The only impediment often, or the only obstacle, is dealing with the camera and making sure that the camera sees you. But I don't find any problem with that. I'm able, in a stage, and the one thing about doing stage is that you have this, you know that you're going to go out there the next night, you know, and you're going to have an opportunity to do it for the first time again at the next night. In film, I think you rely a little bit more on your spontaneity and your intuitive, that intuition that happens, because sometimes it'll happen on the first take. You know, sometimes the choice that I make in the reading, 75% of the time I'm gonna use that choice in the actual performance.
Do you have any intention to go back to theater?
Yeah, I'm really gonna try to spend some time, and I've spoken with the Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, American Conservatory Theater, and spend some time there next year, doing some work. I have every intention to do stage work. I need to be at home in San Francisco for a little while. I seem to be everywhere else but home, And yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Any other questions? Right back here.
Yes, it would appear that to sleep with actor, it did not have the kind of marketing and distribution push that some other films that Sony has got. What lesson did you learn as an executive producer that you'll apply to the next Burnett picture you do in terms of distribution and marketing?
Well, actually, the film was released by Samuel Goldwyn. Sony just put up the financing to do the film. Certainly, I think you have to nurture a film such as this. I think the people at Samuel Goldwyn, the distributors, took some things for granted since there wasn't a great number of films by African Americans. The fact that we had a film, quote unquote, a black film, that people were going to come and see it. I think that that we have to develop strategies. It's important that we develop strategies which we haven't done thus far. We're getting people to see films of this, nuanced films like this. There's certain films that we know how to market them, but no one knew really how to market this film.
Has a co-executive producer got any power in telling the distributor how to promote a film?
Really, no. I think the label, I mean, and it's almost a misnomer, my role as co-executive. The reason why I was co-executive producer was primarily I was the reason why they got the money to do it. You know? And so what I tried to do is to learn as much as I could from that experience. I was privy to decisions that were made in the production schedule, but never any decisions that were made with the marketing of the film. And I didn't know. I must admit my own lack of my own experience got in the way, and I didn't know what we could have done differently at the time. Certainly, we should have cultivated and developed very unique strategies with this film. One, perhaps we could have done is to show the film to church groups. I mean, at conventions, and gotten a following there behind that, particularly the black church, because there's so many elements that are, as you say, quite spiritual. We could have done that. We could have developed a very closer relationship with the African American press, which we didn't. I mean, you can't rise up one morning and tell people who you've ignored in the general marketing of films, of other films, to get involved in this because it's a black film. They don't care, really. Yeah. I mean, they care, but I mean, they don't see it as their responsibility because you come in and tell them it's a good film.
Yeah, the press cares, but they're not at your beck and call.
Exactly, and that's certainly the history of the film, of the press or the studio or the system and its relationship to the black press. And they only come to them when, quote unquote, we need them for something specific, you know, yet in terms of action films, I mean, the numbers are startling at the number of African Americans who go and see action films, you know, and the revenue derived from that. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're going to use us for this event, then use us for other situations as well. I think that's what the black press was saying.
That's well put. Over there you go. All right.
My question is more on a personal note. I'm really excited by you as a black man.
I'm sorry. I couldn't.
He wants to hear that again.
No, I don't want to hear that again. I said, let's go to the next.
As a black woman, I'm
unequivocally, without a doubt, my dad, who, if you can imagine, you looking at me at 6'4", he's 5'2", so he must have been something quite special, and is something quite special to me. My grandfather, those were the two. They're both and come of the same ilk. They come from different experience. My dad comes from an urban background, being born in Kansas City, but here's a man who lost his mother during the same year he was born, in 1919, during the flu epidemic, and yet somehow here's a man who's seen so much of the world and so much through his friends, but who has the incredible compassion and love and beauty, and it's just, to me, he's a very remarkable man, and he was there. I mean, he wasn't athletic, but he was there. He was there in a way and he has these 4 big, humongous sons, you know, and we all love him to death, you know, and he's so angelic in a way. So that and certainly those two. And I was telling someone that I remember my grandmother raised me on the farm like the first year and a half of my life, and I didn't realize until after my mama passed. And I always had this close attachment to my grandfather in a way, but he was a very small man, slight man, very tiny man as well, and yet I was always scared of him. There was something about him, but I really worshipped him in a way. I worshipped him. I remember even being 15 or 16 years old and spending portions of the summer on the farm. Whenever I'd see him coming, I'd walk the other way because I didn't feel that he was almost mythic to me in a way. My grandfather was a mythical man to me in a way. And when I became older and learned to talk to him, I learned so much from him, you know. So those definitely are the 2 men who've been in my life. My grandfather died in '99 last year, September, and my father is still with me. In fact, he travels with me a great deal.
Well, that question reminds me of, if I can get you to do like a verbal high school essay, what does Sidney Poitier mean to you? I mean, he's part of the reason that I'm here. He brought this incredible beauty and dignity to and clarity in a way, you know. I'm really, yeah. I mean, that's what he did. I mean, he's certainly one of my heroes. Paul Robeson is definitely one of my heroes. Has always been. But see, I saw them not growing up in high school, not as people who I wanted to. I mean, as my examples for being active, because I had no idea I was going to do this in high school. I wanted to go work for the post office, I think, after I finished high school. But so in terms of the actors who inspired me just by their work, and if I was to say someone's work someone would be my mentor in some ways, the closest person that I could come to would be James Earl Jones. I remember I used to go to the library when I was in high school because I thought if I went there on Saturday afternoon, I would somehow absorb all the knowledge that was happening in the books.
and reading, and I would read and I would study and all that, but invariably I would go and look at other things. And I remember one Saturday afternoon looking at, Ebony used to come out with the year, the Negro, the whole thing, where it was everything, the best things that happened that year. And I remember around 1963 looking at a copy of this, and there was this story about this young actor who was doing Othello off Broadway at the same time that Olivier was doing it on Broadway. And I didn't know who he was, and I was just so moved by that. And I read about it. I remember him, how he was so immersed and loved what he was doing. And I think that the other thing about Jimmy that I understand later is that he had to overcome handicaps, his own inhibitions. I had to overcome handicaps, my own inhibitions and everything, and often physical inhibition, because I had dyslexia. And so the fact that he overcame those was, for me, remarkable and made him a hero for me. But I remember reading that story, and I was so moved by that. I carried that with me, and I told him about that story about almost 20 years later when I worked on with him in Master Harold and the Boys when he took over with Zay Smokai. But I saw Jimmy do something around 1961. I think it's called A Naked City or something, where he was running out of the housing place with a baby in his hands. It was this child who had been bitten by a rat.
That's East Side, West Side.
East Side, West Side. Yeah. If there's ever a moment that lodged itself in my mind, East Side, West Side, that moment was, it was like, I always remember that moment. I must have saw it, I may have been about 13 or 14 years old, something like that, and I saw that moment. And that was a moment, and this is with no intention of being an actor. As I said before, I never stepped on the stage before I was 20 years old. So it was him, and I kind of followed him in some way throughout, particularly with Great White Hope, I think was the first major thing that but I followed him in his life. And so if there was someone who I would say that, but there are other people who moved me, certainly Harry Belafonte. Harry is now, has always, has been the one who makes sense for me about a whole bunch of this stuff, because of the stand he takes, not only as an actor and as an artist, but as a human being. Brock Peters, I remember Brock Peters and stuff. Those men, him, and certainly the things I saw Paul in. They all had some influence on me first, and then Paul because of the position he took. I always like you for the position you took. If you take the right position, you take the right position, yeah, I'm gonna like you more, and care about you more. And noticeably, I think men and most of the people who are influencing my life have been men who've taken the right position.
Principles.
The right principle.
All right, we get one more question, I guess.
Yep.
All right.
You mentioned earlier on the billing thing, getting top billing, and you mentioned that you're more popular in Europe or abroad in terms of billing than versus here. Historically, Paul Robeson, Woody Strode, they went to Europe to do movies. They were very popular. Why is that?
Well, I'm sorry if I made a mistake. I mean, when I said that I was more popular abroad, had more leverage abroad than perhaps Martin did.
No, I understand that.
You see, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the fact
But
that
historically, a lot of black artists have had to go to Europe to, find what they thought was there.
they were forced out of the system. There was no place for them here. There was no place for Paul. I mean, when Paul went to England, and when Paul worked in England, I mean, he the films that he did and the context of the films were different, and the characters he played were different. I mean, at that particular point in time. So, but Woody had to go and leave because there was no work here. Literally, there was no work here. It's interesting that artists, not only filmmakers or actors, but musicians have gone to Europe as well. Painters have gone to Europe because there was another audience for their work, and another level of appreciation for their work.
But you know, that to ask that question is to answer it, and you know the reason. I mean, the reason is racism.
Yeah.
But what's interesting?
Is that changing? I mean, and you're point blank. Is this a fad we're going?
Yes,
In New Jack City, the movies that are coming out now. Is this, with the hip hop scene, is this going to fade out, or is it a real entity coming on? Spike Lee's having a little trouble with Malcolm X now. People trying to, influence.
Well, if I can answer that, no, I don't think it's ever going to change. But what we see in the example of careers like Spike's and careers like Dandy's is that there is opportunity for black artists to take control of what they do and to get closer to doing it themselves, and by doing it themselves, establish a way to keep on doing it and keep on doing it without depending on someone else. Okay, this gentleman, that's
I
it.
just want to know, who are some of the directors that you most want to work with in the future?
Let's see.
Besides
I said I thought it was interesting working with Volker Solendorfer. This is about 6 or 7 years ago. But certainly some of the directors I worked with in the past, I mean, I like the idea of working, building a relationship over a period of time, and having a group of actors who work on an ensemble. Certainly, I would like to work with Bill Duke again, and we'll work with Bill again. I'll work with Charles Burnett again. I certainly like to work with John Singleton. I'll work with Lawrence Kasdan again, and perhaps even Robert Benton again. I mean, those are directors that stick out right there. I mean, I've had the fortune of working with some of the arguably some of the best directors who've of our time, and I hope that I will continue to have a chance to work with directors who considered in that vein.
Well, that's a good parting note, and we wish the same thing for you. Give him a hand.